All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at an absolutely incredible, yet honestly often completely overlooked piece of history. We're talking about Canada's first and only all-black military battalion. It's this profound story where immense patriotism just completely collides with rigid institutional barriers. And crazily enough, it's a legacy of service that went totally unacknowledged for decades. So, over the next few minutes, we're going to break down their timeline, their staggering contributions to the front lines, and the eventual hard-fought reclamation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion's rightful place in history.
So what exactly happens when you have to fight for the right to fight? Picture the scene. It's August 1914. Tens of thousands of men all across Canada are rushing to their local recruiting centers. They're driven by this deep sense of duty, just incredibly eager to serve. The energy is absolutely electric. But for Black volunteers, that massive rush of patriotism hit an immediate, agonizing brick wall. It leaves us with a pretty heavy question right from the jump. What do you do when you literally have to fight your own country just for the right to fight for it?
The fight to enlist. To really understand the sting of this rejection, you kind of have to remember that these men carried a super proud, multi-generational legacy of military service. We're talking roots going all the way back to the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the rebellions of 1837. Yet despite all that history, systemic racism stood firmly at the recruiting center doors. By the end of 1915, a staggering 200 Black volunteers had been flat out rejected. I mean, imagine standing there, offering to give up your life for your nation, only to be explicitly told they don't want you. Or worse, being told right to your face that it's a white man's war.
By 1915, a deep and very vocal divide had basically fractured the nation. On one hand, Black leaders across Canada found these sweeping rejections totally unacceptable. They were firing off letters to militia headquarters, to the Governor General, basically demanding the right to enlist and wanting some clear answers. But on the flip side, white recruits and commanding officers were outright refusing to serve alongside Black men. They claimed it threatened unit cohesion. So suddenly, the military establishment in Ottawa is squeezed squarely in the middle of this intense public pressure cooker.
Creating the Black Battalion.
Now, the military desperately needed manpower, mostly because of the devastating casualties piling up at the front, but they still stubbornly refused to truly integrate their forces. And the rationale here was rooted in deep systemic colonial anxiety. The British War Office flat out refused to allow any Black units into combat on the Western Front. Why? Well, they were actually terrified that these men might eventually use their advanced combat training against British authorities back in the colonies. So the compromise that finally broke the stalemate came in April 1916. It was a specialized labor unit. This let the military utilize all this willing manpower without ever actually putting weapons directly into their hands.
Once that compromise was struck, things moved surprisingly fast. Following the proposal in April 1916, British authorities formally approved the idea just a month later, in May. And finally, on July 5, 1916, the No. 2 Construction Battalion was officially authorized under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Sutherland. They quickly set up their headquarters in Nova Scotia and launched this massive nationwide recruitment push. And because they were uniquely specialized, they were actually one of the few units permitted to recruit across the entire country. They pulled in determined men from the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, and all the way out to Western Canada.
Overseas service and setbacks.
So by March 28, 1917, the unit finally sails from Halifax for England. But the institutional barriers they fought so hard against, those crossed the Atlantic right alongside them. Just look at the stark breakdown of their leadership structure. Out of the 19 officers who sailed with the battalion, 18 of them were white. The single Black officer permitted in the entire unit was their chaplain, Reverend William Andrew White. The rank-and-file troops were entirely Black men, completely eager to serve, yet they were systematically barred from holding top leadership roles within their very own unit. It's wild to think about. And upon arriving in Liverpool, they were immediately hit with a massive logistical roadblock. They had sailed with 595 men, but that number fell significantly short of the strict 1,049 men required by the War Office to be classified as a full working battalion. Because of this technicality, the War Office flatly refused to deploy them to France as a fighting force. The frustration must have been just immense. So they were downgraded, reformed as a 500-man labor company, now officially called the No. 2 Canadian Construction Company, and sent off to the Jura Mountains in southeast France to support the Canadian Forestry Corps.
Fueling the war effort. Once they finally arrived in France in May 1917, they took on massive, unglamorous, but absolutely vital work. We so often picture the First World War purely in terms of, bullets, gas, and barbed wire, but lumber? Lumber was the absolute backbone of survival.
These men improved logging roads, they maintained camp water systems, and processed massive amounts of timber that literally kept the war machine alive. Think about it, without their processed lumber for duckboards, soldiers would drown in the freezing, muddy trenches. They built the revetting that stopped trenches from collapsing, they constructed artillery platforms, railway ties, ammunition boxes. Their grueling physical labor completely freed up the lumberjacks to mill trees at an unprecedented pace.
And the crucial takeaway here is this massive multiplier, 2x. The direct logistical support and relentless labor of the No. 2 Construction Company allowed the Canadian Forestry Corps to produce more than twice as much lumber as mills operating without them, 2 times. They literally doubled the output of the war effort in their sector through nothing but sheer grit, determination, and hard work.
Yet, even while doubling production and acting as the logistical spine of their sector, they still couldn't escape the prejudice of military leadership. In late 1917, a group of 180 men were pulled away and relocated to Alençon in northwest France. The reason? A completely baseless, ignorant assumption by leadership who believed that black men, simply because some hailed from the US or the Caribbean, couldn't handle the cold weather of the Jura Mountains. Honestly, it was an insulting, exhausting myth they had to navigate daily, all while doing the heavy lifting for the entire army.
Tensions and demobilization. When the armistice was finally signed in November 1918, you'd think things would get better, right? But the transition to peace was fraught with the exact same prejudice they faced back in enlistment. In January 1919, while held in camps waiting to go home, tensions boiled over into the Kimmel Park riot in Wales. A black sergeant from the battalion tried to arrest a white soldier for insolence. The result? A violent attack by white soldiers who flat-out refused to respect the rank and authority of a black peer. It was a bitter, violent reminder that despite serving under the exact same flag, equality in the ranks was still just an illusion. After the riots, the military moved quickly to disperse them. The men were rushed onto troop ships in January 1919, loaded onto trains the exact moment they hit Halifax, and sent back to their home provinces. They were discharged by late February, and by September 1920, the battalion was officially disbanded. Because they were non-combatants, and because they were spread so incredibly thinly across the massive Canadian landscape upon their return, their monumental contributions were quickly and conveniently erased from public consciousness.
Reclaiming a forgotten legacy.
For decades, the largest black unit in Canadian history was completely missing from our textbooks. It wasn't commemorated widely. It really took dedicated champions to trace this memory back into the light. While a plaque was quietly unveiled in Toronto in 1920, the real, undeniable shift happened in the 1980s, and that was thanks to Senator Calvin Ruck's extensive, tireless research into the battalion. His relentless work led to a National Historic Event designation in 1992, a permanent granite monument erected in Pictou, Nova Scotia in 1993, and finally, a 2016 Canada Post stamp, cementing their faces and their story in our national memory forever.
And the modern impact of this history, it's absolutely undeniable. Just take a look at a comment from a listener tuning into a recent documentary about the unit. They wrote, "Wish TIFF or another film festival can feature a recent film that goes into the lives, adventures, accomplishments of these resilient men. Audiences today are completely captivated by this story. We want to see the grit, the determination, and the adventure of these men celebrated on the big screen. It really proves that this century-old story resonates just as powerfully today as it ever did." So as we wrap up this explainer and reflect on the immense resilience of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, men who literally had to fight their own country just to have the privilege to serve it, it leaves us with a critical, lingering question. What other world-changing hidden histories are out there waiting in the shadows for us to uncover them next? Take a moment to think about the stories we've missed and the profound power in finally bringing them to the light. Thanks for joining me on this one.